All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For some of you guys, probably join us today to another live session with Veeam. This one's going to be a fun one, I think, because it's all about security in AWS. It doesn't matter where you look in terms of research, who you're talking to. It seems like security is just at the top of everyone's list right now. What with all the increase in ransomware and everything that kind of threatens our organizations today. So we've got a big one to talk about because we're going to talk about security in the cloud. Isn't that right, David?
That is right. All we're going to talk about today is the cloud and security.
It's fun, right? Because, I think a number of organizations that we speak to kind of often have this misperception that the cloud is less secure than on premises. And simply not true, right? Security in the cloud is actually very similar, just instead of, having a lot of hardware, it's just very software based. And we've got a ton of built-in options when it comes to, security in AWS. And there's lots of third-party options as well that you can, leverage through the marketplace. And I do apologize, like the garbage guys just decided to come at the perfect time. So if you guys can hear that, my bad. So hopefully they don't distract you all too much. But yes, we're absolutely talking about security in AWS today. Before we do get started, what we like to do is see where everyone is joining us from. And I've seen a number of folks already post in the chat right now where you guys are tuning in from. So if we take a look, I am up here in Wisconsin where the weather is getting colder and colder. David, it's a little bit more warm for you in Texas, right?
So now I've got a hoodie on today, so it's not that warm.
I don't think it's as cold as it
I
is
do,
here.
I do have my Veeam Vanguard hoodie on just to give the Vanguards a little promotion.
Fantastic. Our video guy is joining us from Atlanta, Georgia. Looks like we've already got some folks joining us from Mexico, Belgium. Our social media people that make all of this happen for you guys are based out of Bucharest in Romania. And we've got anyone else joining us from across the world today? Not this early, but throw down in the comments where you're joining us from, and we'll be happy to kind of see where you guys. I can already see Germany, Argentina, London. Another fellow Wisconsinite. Hello. Randy, actually, you work for Veeam, so I know you're on the opposite side of the state from me. Cool. Well, let's get started and start talking about security in the cloud. And I think the first thing to really talk about is the cloud less secure than on premises? So David, why don't you give us a little bit of a rundown on that one?
Yeah, so it's a good question because, as you said, that there's a misconception that the cloud's not quite as secure, but it's like everything. The same considerations, whether you're putting workloads in the cloud or putting workloads on premises, always apply. And it's all around like firewall rules, security policies, and implementing things like that. And it doesn't matter whether you're building physical servers in a data center, running vSphere, or using like AWS as the public cloud. You go set your firewall rules to any, then guess what? People are going to come in and people are going to be able to mess around and see what's going on in your environment. So you have to implement the correct security policies for those public clouds in exactly the same way as you would do on premises. And if you don't, then you're going to see the same challenges that you would see on premises if you don't design it right.
Absolutely. And this is kind of like a best practice section. So we are going to pick David's brain a little bit later on and kind of see what he has to say in terms of what are the best practices when it comes to the cloud. But one thing that I do want to turn to is the shared responsibility model. Now, we're going to kind of talk about AWS's, but Microsoft have their own if you're using Azure. Google has their own. I think it's called the shared responsibility matrix. But irrespective of who's we're actually talking about, they're all talking about very, very similar things. It's all about delineating where the responsibility of you, the consumer of that public cloud, is and where the responsibility of that cloud provider lies. And that applies to security, it applies to data protection as well. So when we look at different services within AWS, they're going to be the ones that are responsible for security of the cloud, right? So the infrastructure, the operating systems, and this is actually pretty dynamic depending on kind of which service you're consuming, whether it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. As you adopt those different services, you are transitioning varying degrees of responsibility to AWS or to that cloud provider. But one thing remains true is that it is always your data and it is always up to you to secure and protect that. So you can go out, check out their shared responsibility models. They do make it very, very clear as to, depending on what you're using. Again, IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, where they're going to assume the responsibility for security and protection, and where it remains your responsibility to secure and protect that. David, anything that you want to add around shared responsibility?
Yeah, ultimately, it just comes down to what are you buying? And when you think about the kind of the service level agreements that you get with the public cloud as well, is you're not buying like hardware from the cloud. You're essentially leasing or renting a service from them, no different to going and renting a generator when the power goes out. You're not buying it. So the fuel is always your responsibility that you have to put in a generator. And if somebody goes and steals your gas can, then guess what? Your generator's not going to work. It's the same kind of concept when you're leveraging cloud services in a shared responsibility model. That data is your own. That is the fuel of your business now. Nobody who is in business can survive without the data that they gather around their customers. So making sure that your data is secure and that you have a successful backup policy, successful recovery policy, and just a strategy in place is critical to making sure that your business runs regardless of whether you're running in the public cloud or on-prem. But when we look at that shared responsibility model and what you're actually purchasing, always consider how am I going to protect that data, whether I'm leveraging like EC2 instances and running like Windows VMs, or whether I'm using like RDS instances where I don't actually see or touch any of the management. I just use a particular service.
Absolutely. So before we start diving into some of these best practices, and I think what we're going to do is just going to take an approach, like a very broad approach, helping to understand some of the terminologies and best practices in that cloud. And then we'll start to tie them into like Veeam solutions and how we leverage those to make sure that your data that you have on premises that you may be backing up to AWS, or data that you have running in AWS that you also need to secure and protect, how you can put those into practice with Veeam solutions. But before we do that, let's turn to our map, because I've seen a ton of people coming through. This looks like a very popular session. So if we cut to the United States, my geography with the US is pretty good because I had to I had to learn it for my citizenship test. But of course, we got Wisconsin, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio. I think that's Arkansas, Washington. So welcome to you guys. Let's take a cut over to Europe. I hope I know what that island is because that's where I'm from. So that looks like the UK. Again, Belgium, Germany, Czech Republic. We've got some folks joining us from Greece as well. So welcome to everyone there. I believe that is Argentina from our South American cohort. So welcome. Morocco, India. This is testing me, guys. I think that's Vietnam, and that small little dot is likely Singapore down there. So welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us wherever you're joining us from across the globe. Right now, we're going to start diving into some of our cloud security best practices, and more specifically as it relates to AWS. So David, why don't you talk to us a little bit about kind of resource access authorization, kind of how we build security boundaries within the cloud and then grant access to those specific resources or across those resources?
Yeah, so when you look at like AWS best practices around just data in general, the AWS recommends that you use different AWS accounts for different domains. So whether that be different business units, different environments, those kind of things. So if you think about like a traditional production staging dev test kind of environment that is very traditional in IT, you would use AWS accounts for those separate ones. So you'd have a separate AWS account for production, you'd have a separate AWS account for staging, dev test, and then maybe one for your backups and data protection. Why is that a best practice? Well, because you can define different security accounts, you can define different user accounts across those AWS accounts to protect your environment. And there's a great story that I've talked about for years now around about a business called Code Spaces. Now, brilliant business, and they essentially had all their workloads running in AWS. They had all their backups and all their data stored in S3 as well, and they got hit by a brute force attack, and obviously went in, changed all the root passwords and everything. So then sent out some ransom request saying, I've got access to your environment. If you don't give me X amount of dollars, I'm going to delete everything. Now, rightly so, in my opinion, the business owner was like, no, we have backups, go do your worst, we'll recover from this, you're not getting any money. Unfortunately for them, they didn't realize he had the root access keys. And this is going back 10 years now. And obviously AWS has implemented a lot of different security policies in this time now. But essentially what happened was the guy went and deleted all the production workloads, and then sent another note saying, right, I want more money. And of course, Code Spaces were like, no, we'll just restore from backups. So the guy went and deleted all their backups as well, because it was in the same AWS account. So they literally lost everything overnight. There was no more business. There was no more infrastructure. They'd lost all their customers' code that they used to keep, everything. It was all gone. So they went out of business overnight. And it's tragic because Code Spaces was a great business, but it just shows that making sure that you have different security boundaries and different security policies in place is critical to protect that data. And when we look at that as well, leveraging things like IAM roles is critical. So you can build out all different policies in AWS, assign different keys, give them different access rights across all these different accounts to help make sure that your security boundaries and your data isn't all accessible by, say, like one user account. And then, of course, you look into things like role-based access control as well. So if you're a backup administrator, you may not necessarily have access to production data, but you have access to the backup data. And same with production admins may not have access to the backup data, because we've all heard tales of that IT support guy who got fired because he was being a bit silly at work, and then he goes in and deletes all the data as he's walking out the door. Well, you don't want that to happen. So implementing all these different security policies across these different accounts is very critical to keep all that data safe.
So you mentioned a bit about, AWS recommending leveraging different accounts for things like production and dev test, but it sounds like you are a proponent of having a separate account for backup as well.
That's right, yeah. So AWS actually recommend that in their best practices as well, is like store all your backup data in S3 object storage or archive like Glacier and Deep Archive and all that stuff, but have it in a separate AWS account. So you have different security policies, different access roles using IAM and that kind of stuff. So, and for anyone who's not familiar, IAM stands for Identity and Access Management, and that allows you to create different policies and roles compared to separate between those AWS accounts.
Okay, so from a Veeam perspective, let's have a look at maybe how we protect data that lives in AWS. Talk to us a little bit about how we can we place those backups in a separate account, and if so, kind of how easy is that to do?
Yeah, so if you look at like Veeam Backup for AWS, for example, that has built-in ability to access multiple AWS accounts. So you can have production data across like several AWS accounts, for example, and then you can have a separate backup account, and it's really simple. You just define your backup repositories, what account you want to put them in, go create some S3 object storage buckets, and then just define your backup policies and say, we want to go protect this data in these AWS production accounts, and we want all this data stored in these accounts. And then, of course, some other considerations as well, and this isn't just about what Veeam does, but in AWS in general, is replicating your data across regions as well. So even just replicating snapshots across accounts into different regions. So you can restore very quickly from a snapshot. So if somebody does breach that particular AWS account, you can go to another AWS account and restore from snapshot very, very quickly. So lots of considerations that you can apply to meet those best practices. And then, of course, always think about the 3-2-1 rule when you're talking about data protection, which is 3 copies of your data across 2 media types with at least 1 off-site. Now, if you take the cloud as an example, like your production data, there's one copy of it. Then you can go and copy that as a backup to a S3 object storage bucket in a different region. So you can do it in different country, whatever you want to do. So there's another copy of your data and a different media type. Then go do snapshots and snapshot replication. So you have another media type and go do it to different regions as well. So it's very easy to meet that 3-2-1 rule in the public cloud because you're not having to go out and buy all this hardware, storage hardware, just to go and store your backup data. You can just do it. Obviously, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's infinite storage in the public cloud.
Absolutely. And I know we're kind of laser focused on AWS today, but the same principles apply to other cloud platforms as well, right? So with Microsoft Azure, we would leverage different subscriptions as security boundaries. If you're an adopter of Google Cloud Platform, we'd leverage different projects. And of course, Veeam has the ability to back up any workload or the workloads in any of those clouds and leverage those security best practices to make sure that you do have a secure backup strategy that doesn't necessarily have holes in it, like David's Codespaces example, which I know he loves telling.
I'm a fan of that story.
It's a sorry story, but sometimes backup isn't enough. It has to be well architected backup, right? And we talk about well architected frameworks within AWS as well. They go out, lay out those best practices for you. They're out there for everyone to see, and ultimately just making sure that you adhere to those security best practices, those data protection best practices. Understanding what is your responsibility and what is AWS's is ultimately going to help you have that much more watertight strategy when it comes to security and protection. So I do want to start to move on to some other aspects of security as well, which is around like protecting data at rest, encryption keys. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about that, David?
Yeah. So when you're talking about like where you're going to store your backups and how you're going to store them, encryption at rest is critical for anything that you're storing, because again, it's like anything. If somebody can get access to it and pull that data out, if it's encrypted, they're not going to be able to do much with it anyway. So anyone who's familiar with AWS will know about their KMS service, their key management service, where you can just go in and create your keys and very easily just go in to KMS, go click on something and say, create me a key. And then you can use those keys to encrypt data in object storage. And all the data that you put in those object storage backup repositories, if you're using like Veeam Backup for AWS, you can leverage those KMS keys and it'll just do like envelope encryption. So all the data that's stored in those S3 object storage buckets is all encrypted. And without that key, you're not able to decrypt it. So that's a critical kind of tool in the security tool set, if you want to look at it that way, to make sure that the data that you're protecting, the data that you're putting out in these backup accounts is not only separated from the production accounts, but also encrypted. So if there is any case of data theft or anything like that, then people still can't do anything with it, because without the keys, they can't get access to the data and that kind of thing.
It's actually a really interesting point as well, as we start to see some of the ransomware strategies change, right? Before it was just like, we're not going to give you access to your data if you don't pay this ransom. But, some folks have these like watertight strategies where it's just like, okay, well, we can recover from a backup. And some of these ransomers, people holding your data ransom, will just turn around, okay, well, we'll just leak the data on the internet. So ensuring that data is encrypted so they can't actually see what the data is critically important as well. And one of the other interesting things that you mentioned, it's like a little bit of a pivot, is, you're talking about object storage. And, I'm sure the majority of folks joining us today have on-premises data centers, right? They have a hybrid environment, and you might be leveraging AWS for data protection purposes of your on-premises data, right? So being able to back up and archive your data into things like S3, S3 Glacier, S3 Glacier Deep Archive. So when you talk to us about some best practice when it comes to air gapping those backups in S3 and other features that might be available to help us from a security standpoint.
Yeah, so when you're looking at like those different object storage tiers, that's really good when you think about like long-term data retention and what we can use there. So things like Glacier and Deep Archive and that kind of thing, you can leverage those to not only lower your storage costs, because it's really simple, really easy to just implement like policies that will offload your backups after a set number of days. So it's, for example, Veeam backup for AWS. If you take some backups and you offload those to S3 object storage, after 90 days of keeping those for data retention, it'll automatically get moved to Glacier, and that'll reduce your storage costs even more. And then after 180 days, it'll get moved over to Deep Archive, or Deep Glacier, whatever the latest name they've given it is. And essentially what that allows you to do is keep your data for longer. So if you think about like HIPAA is a great example. So anyone who works in the medical industry knows that on average, most medical companies have to keep their data records for like 7 years. Now, if you're a big medical practice, that's a lot of data. So being able to just leverage like Glacier and Deep Archive and everything and move that off and lower those storage costs is critical. But it also helps you architect a more successful backup solution, because if you've got your most recent backups in S3, some more later backups in Glacier, and then you archive some more off later, then even if you've got security breaches and somebody goes and deletes certain data or whatever's going on there, you can still go back further in time and recover from those later backups. Takes longer, obviously your RTOs go up, but you're able to pull that data back and make a difference and restore that as well. So from that architecture perspective, again, it goes to that 3-2-1 rule of different media types and stuff like that. So always bear that in mind, how you can use different storage tiers, different classes, and also longer term data retention to meet your compliance requirements as well.
And there's a little thing called S3 object lock as well, right? So what's the premise behind that?
S3 object lock, or better known as immutability. So, and anybody who doesn't know what immutability means, go Google it. It's in Wikipedia. It took me a little while, but essentially it's anything that can't be deleted. So immutability, Veeam backup and replication, for example, has had immutability support for quite some time. And you can leverage like different archive tiers and S3 object storage with immutability to not only offload your backups to object storage, but lock them as well. So for a set number of days, nobody can delete those objects. The only way you could delete those objects in S3 is to go and delete your AWS account. And then AWS has certain policies in place to make sure that, you know, you can't just go delete it and then today it's all gone. So it is recoverable. So literally, when you define some backup policies, you can turn immutability on to say, right, okay, these backups I want to keep for 90 days, make them immutable. Immutable? Is that the right word? I'm getting confused with immutable, immutability. But essentially lock them so that nothing can touch them. They can't be edited, they can't be deleted, they can't be removed. So there's no way that the data in those objects can change, so that you know for that specific amount of time how that data is protected. There's going to be no changes to it. And if you need to restore from it, it's exactly the same as the moment you put it up there.
Absolutely. So basic, write once, read many practice.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think like the final thing that I just want to talk about in regards to security is around VPCs. So David, do you want to talk to us a little bit I say I'm going to talk about VPCs. I really just want you to talk about it. So what a VPC is, should you back it up? How can you back it up?
Yeah, so a VPC is a virtual private cloud, and that's where all your information around your environment that you're deploying, like instances and subnet configurations, or your network configurations, all that kind of thing is contained. And essentially what you're doing is you're creating your own data center in AWS with a VPC. So you'll go and create all your different network classes, all your network IPs, all your security groups, your firewall rules, that kind of thing. So when you think about backing up your data and protecting your data in AWS, you might just think, well, all I need to do is go and protect this one EC2 instance that runs this workload. But what you have to remember is when you restore that data then needs somebody to access it. So if you've got a load of different subnets and different firewall rules, security groups, that kind of thing, you also need to be able to recover them. So from a VPC perspective in AWS, being able to back up that configuration, all your ACLs, that kind of thing, and being able to restore them in the event of a deletion or failure or anything like that, and you need to recover everything, helps you build out that disaster recovery or business continuity solution, because it's not just about that one workload, it's about all the supporting components that go with it. So from that perspective, always look at how you can protect your VPC configuration data, your EC2 instances, your RDS instances, and that kind of thing.
Fantastic. All right, well, that kind of brings us to a close on this high-level discussion around security in AWS that David and I wanted to have. We absolutely appreciate you all joining us today. I want to turn to the map just for kind of one last update to see where some more folks have joined us from. So it looks like some more folks from Texas have joined, New York. I think that's all the changes for the United States. Okay, there was some folks joining us from Slovakia as well. Brazil, that's a big one. So not a huge test of my geographical knowledge there. And then Australia as well, another big one. So thanks for you guys keeping it easy on my geographical knowledge today. We do appreciate you joining us all. If you guys do have any recommendations or requests on anything that you would like Dave and I to discuss, whether it's public cloud, AWS focused, anything really regarding the public cloud for another future LinkedIn Live, please post those in the comments and we'll absolutely be happy to host that one for you. The only final thing that I want to leave you with are a couple of teasers. So the tease for Monday, Industry Insights, that's the infamous, I should say famous, Jason Buffington and Dave Russell with part one of a two-part series on really kind of managing and any remaining use it or lose it budget that you have to really set yourselves up for success in 2022. And then we do have a show Friday with Rick and team, but we haven't actually got a topic set for that. But please check back on Monday and we'll have that updated there. And that kind of brings us to a close. So I do want to say thanks to everyone for joining us today. And we hope to see you on a LinkedIn or live session sometime soon.
Well, dang. Ransomware had my data all jacked up. If only I had secure backup.